early good evening to wherever you are in the world. Thank you for jumping in here with us today on this webinar with Industrial Cyber TP Research and sponsored by Cyolo. Grateful for you being here today. Thank you for jumping in. We're going to give it a few minutes as folks finish up what they're doing in their day to find the time in their calendar to join us today. A couple more minutes and we'll be getting started there. So thank you again for being here. Excited to share a lot of what we're talking about today. And again, we'll get started here in a couple minutes. Hello, everybody. Welcome again. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. We're going to get started here in a few minutes. Give folks just a little bit of time to finish up their last meetings or whatever they were working on before jumping in here with us today. Quick, fun little thing here. Want to know, and you can open up the chat and you can drop the note in chat. Kind of a fun question for you as we get started. What is your favorite type of music? I'm going to write it here in the chat. And go ahead and drop a note in the chat. Let us know what do you like to listen to? And I know it could be very dependent on what it is that you're doing, whether you're, if you're in a workout or if you're needing to focus intently or whatever it is you're doing, you're eating dinner with your family or spending time with friends. What is your favorite type of music? Drop it in the chat here. Seeing some great responses. We have Indian music coming in here. And we have, it looks like a specific artist name. It looks like this artist performs samba music. Oh, that's fun. The Beatles, a classic, old Hindi songs. That's amazing. And a couple other votes here coming in. Oh, interesting. Classic music. I'm not sure if we're talking about, classic rock, classical. And if so, if classical, what type of classical music? Are we talking about Baroque? Are we talking about a little more modern? Where are we going there? We got country music, pop, hip hop, R&B, all great choices here. Your favorite type of music is the question. Drop it in the chat as we get started here. We're waiting for some folks. And then heavy metal, which this person commented is appropriate for ICS. Makes a lot of sense. You have a lot of heavy metal flying around your different plants or systems, some big heavy iron there. Country music, rock music, hip hop that criticized systems. Interesting. So more of the socially aware hip hop, perhaps. Jazz, reggae, man, a lot of great options here. Interesting here. Soda Stereo, which is described as Argentinian rock. And Papo, I'm probably saying it wrong. Papo, this person describes them as the Argentinian BB King. That sounds amazing. The Argentinian BB King. Anytime you're associated with BB King, I'm in on that, man. That's fantastic. Thank you for that answer right there. That's awesome. Hey, thank you for participating in that. That's a little bit of fun to get started here. We're going to go ahead and chat about some interesting things we got talking about today. My name is Samuel Hill. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Cyolo, and I am really, really pleased to welcome you guys to today's webinar. Going to be a lot of fun. We have a really cool topic to chat about. We've done some very interesting research. Maybe some of you participated in answering the survey questions, but we're going to kind of run through a little bit of a little preview of the results of some of this research to share some of that with you guys, and then just have a discussion about all that kind of stuff. As we get going today, before we get started really, couple of housekeeping notes. Yes, you will get information after the fact, and we will share some of the stuff that we're presenting with you today. We will also have very specific ways that you can get your copy of this research report so that you can dive into it, process it with your teams, and hopefully gain a little bit of knowledge and advantage as you're going about your day-to-day process there. We want this to be highly interactive. We know that there's a lot of information we're going to share today. In the Zoom at the bottom, there's a Q&A feature. Would you please put your questions in the Q&A? If you put them in chat, I can't guarantee that I will see them and be able to ask our panelists about that. So please put them in the Q&A section. We will make sure that we get to those questions. And if we do not answer your question live in this webinar, fun thing about Zoom, they actually give us a list of every question. We will reply to you with an email to talk specifically about the question if we don't happen to get to it in our live section here. So With that, let's meet our panelists today as we go forward on the slide. My name is Samuel Hill. I lead product marketing here at Cyolo Security, and I'm going to be our moderator today, kind of helping to ask questions and direct the show. With me today is Kevin Kumpf, who's our chief OT strategist at Cyolo, and Jonathan Gordon, who's the directing analyst at TP Research. And I'm going to let these gentlemen introduce themselves. Kevin, give us a little short bio about yourself, and then followed by Jonathan.
Thank you, Samuel. My name is Kevin Kumpf. I've been in the industry now over 15 years. I was the director of OT security for one of the world's largest utilities at Iberdrola. I have experience working in the industrial space for many of the manufacturers as both a consultant and an employee. And I also have a diverse background in working for the many key vendors in the industry, and I've helped drive a lot of the innovation that those vendors have put forth to help the OT industry as well.
And Jonathan.
Yeah, okay. So welcome everybody. Jonathan Gordon, directing analyst for TechPoint Research. I spend most of my day speaking to end users, industrial enterprises, occasional vendors and service providers as well, really trying to understand the big picture of what's happening in the industrial cybersecurity space, both everything from cyber physical systems through to sort of higher level cybersecurity issues, and really trying to understand how to better protect and how to reduce risk to industrial cybersecurity companies. So we do that across the world and across verticals as well.
And I know we're very grateful for your partnership with us, Kevin and Jonathan, helping us to understand a little bit about what's going on. So Jonathan, I know we have some interesting statistics and data to talk about, but we did a survey, and I think what last count, we had well over 200 respondents to this survey. So this is a statistically significant sample size for the space, and some very interesting questions and some unique data points that have come out of this survey. I know we're going to dive into that, but why don't you walk us through a little bit about the survey itself and maybe some of the key results that we're presenting today?
Sure, Samuel. So let's get underway. Yes, we actually have an upcoming research report that's specifically in the area of industrial secure remote access. And the survey that we conducted aligns very well with the survey, with the actual report that we're putting out. And what it is, it's more quantitative data as opposed to qualitative data about the space. So we went out, as you said, to just over 200 respondents in across regions, across industries. You can see the various industries here, and also across different size companies. This is really a wide-ranging sort of piece of research. Here's a breakdown. You can see I won't spend too much time on any one of these slides. Obviously, they'll be available in the recording and in the actual piece of research, which will be coming out shortly. But you can see that out of the big sort of respondents, manufacturing was the number one, not too far behind oil and gas, power and energy, metals, mining, and minerals as well, pharmaceuticals. So you can see there's quite a large and diverse sort of response with regards to industries, which is, again, quite adds to the interest. Same thing with the regions, although there's quite a large chunk from North America here. You also have a corresponding sort of pieces from Europe, Middle East, Africa. Sometimes vendors tend to put these, for some reason, these regions together into EMEA or EMEA. And also some from Asia and Latin America as well. And with regards to the organizations and size of the enterprise, what's interesting is where we did get a large percentage of very large enterprises. Again, size is sort of all relative, in particular when you're looking at the industrial enterprises, but anything over 10,000 employees is 42% of the survey respondents. But we did get an interesting amount also from what we would call very small companies in this space to small companies make up 40% as well. And lastly, and probably the most interesting, we'll come back to this a little later, is the breakdown in roles. People, again, very diversified, quite a few from the the plant side, the site, the OT or the automation side, so the engineering roles responded here. Also people within that have some sort of IT or cybersecurity function within the plant or within the site, which is quite interesting. On the flip side, we have what you would consider, I guess, the standard type of titles that you find in any type of enterprise. So the CISO, who's typically in charge. In a lot of cases these days holds the responsibility, accountability for these sort of projects, also holds the budget typically as well, or more typically, I should say. And then you see security, security managers, directors, administration, IT team, which is interesting as well. And then the I guess, just generic corporate or IT cybersecurity team. And what's quite interesting is the big section here, or biggest single section, I should say, is, again, we ask people how they identify themselves. So the large chunk is OT cybersecurity team. And I think we don't have any sort of look back on this, but my feeling is if we had have done this survey a couple of years ago, that would have been much smaller. And it seems to be that the OT security team, if you like, is starting to bridge the sort of divide between what we would say, I guess, a typical enterprise cybersecurity to people, actually the engineers and the people out in the actual sites. So this is quite interesting. And we'll come back to this later when we look at the makeup of these teams. But what's very interesting is the diverse responses that we received. I think it adds a richness to the survey result that you don't often see in these type of surveys. So that's the demographics and methodology, I guess, done. As Samuel said, I think it was 204 at last count with regards to respondents. So we started out by asking them the very sort of basic question of why. Why do you need people to connect to your industrial systems? What's the business reason or requirement behind that? And this was a question that we asked that, tick all the boxes. So it's not mutually exclusive, but obviously number one here, almost 70% of respondents said that it was to allow third parties to access their OT or ICS assets, which I think would be expected and a common sort of answer. Speaking to most people, there's a requirement to actually get people in that, either from the service providers or OEMs or whoever actually takes care of those assets and devices. And increased productivity and I guess cost reduction, which is the next one down, sort of go hand in hand. The idea is that the alternative is to get somebody out to the site, which is to fly them out and find time for the right person. So there's always a huge cost involved in that type of thing. It takes a lot more time. So the idea of increasing productivity, speed to get to the right skills, the right point, the right time, and reducing the cost to do that. And what's interesting is probably because it didn't come out all that high, was actually the need to collect data from the OTS devices, which again may have something to do with the type of people that were responding, but also the types of verticals too. But again, a lot of these are common reasons I think that we see when we ask this question. One of the thing that stood out, particularly because of the sample size and the large amount, I guess high amount of large and medium organizations, is this a big company problem, right? Is it only the big guys that really need to worry about this? And what we did is we asked them how many people, again, this is a guesstimate, obviously, but how many people do they expect? What number of users are actually connecting remotely to the ICS or the industrial environment? And what we see is in the large companies, so there's 10,000 employees or more, we see a very large chunk of over 50 users per day. This was sort of like the highest limit. So you can definitely see that in the bigger companies, there are more people connecting. In the medium companies, and by far the majority was somewhere between 10 and 50, 11 to 50, and it seems to go down. So what we noticed when we looked at the numbers is there is obviously a distinct correlation between the size of the company and the amount of remote users connecting. But doesn't necessarily mean that it's a big company problem, because when we drill down and we bring in another sort of facet and we ask people across the different size companies, what's their primary objective for actually to achieve when securing the remote access. And this looks surprisingly even across the different size companies. So when you look at things like compliance, you would expect larger companies to have more exposure to compliance. So it kind of makes sense that compliance would be a larger response in a bigger response into larger companies. But apart from compliance, when you look at the areas, lowering impact operational safety, preventing incidents of ransomware, lower the cost of maintenance support, and last coming is improved user experience. They all seem to be quite consistent or evenly spread, regardless of the size of the company, which is quite, it tells a tale that the fact that there's a linear sort of correlation between the amount of people connecting and the size of the company, but it's not offset by the fact that people are concerned about the same things and trying to achieve the same objectives. So I think that the takeaway here is that smaller companies have the same sort of risks and the same sort of threats as the larger companies, and very often have less resources, both skills and financial resources, to be able to actually do something about it. But they do have the same sort of objectives and concerns. So moving along, we then went and asked survey respondents to sort of drill down on the cybersecurity frameworks and regulations and guidelines. There are so many around today to figure out what it is that either they have to comply with or they have decided to align with. And again, this was not mutually exclusive, but as we can see, the 62443 from my IEC came out, just pipped the 800.82, which is, again, I think has to do with the audience. And when we look at the regions, if you recall, that over 40% is North America. So we would expect that 800.82, which is a NIST guideline, again, mostly closely followed by people in North America, would come out quite at the top. And I think what we tend to see, 62443 is more European, but we do see, we tend to see people in other regions beyond Europe also focusing on that sort of framework and trying to align with that. Again, there could be some crossover. We see things like MITRE ATT&CK for ICS, which again is not in the same sort of categories of framework, but it looks at things like kill chains and how you can get access to these environments. And of course, things like NERC-CIP, which are very, very specific to North America, very, very specific to power and energy. So the interesting thing is that a lot of people are aligning or have selected a particular framework. And of course, there's a lot of compliance around that we can talk about later as well. Coming back to the roles, which I think is one of the, as I mentioned, one of the most interesting parts of the survey and one of the most sort of rich parts of the data, is that there tend to be more and more people involved in this topic, in general with securing industrial enterprises, specifically with securing the remote access. And this is what we see when we speak to clients as well, and we engage with them, is that the teams that are more successful are quite diverse and multidisciplinary. And we tend to encourage our clients to really build a team, but also build these roles and responsibilities. So this, for example, is I guess a sample RACI matrix or model that came out of our research report. Again, it's for those of you not familiar with a RACI matrix, it really details the roles, accountabilities, responsibilities, who should be informed with regards to the different parts of the project. And what it does is to make sure that people that need to know and are responsible or need to be made accountable or informed about the decisions have these assigned roles. That's typically something that comes from project management and the IT world. We're starting to see this more cutting across both IT and OT. And essentially, it's a tool for bringing people together and making sure that people that have to do the job are actually authorized to do it, and whoever needs to give that authorization and who never needs to be informed about that actually it makes sure the project keeps moving forward. And the way we like to approach these type of projects is to make sure that, again, there's a very sort of multidisciplinary team. We have people from OT, we have engineers, we have automation folks, we have safety folks around the table, cybersecurity people, CISOs, etc. And the idea of the racing model is really to define what the role of each person is as they progress through this project. Again, this is the example, not to be used essentially tomorrow, and because different companies will have different internal roles. But what's also important to notice is that we also have external roles in this process, particularly when we talk about securing remote access. There's typically someone that's on the other end that may be external to the company. So it's important when you look at the roles and responsibility and you build out these projects to secure remote access, that you also look at from the external side, who will actually be participating. Is a great idea if they're a close provider or close partner to bring them into that project as well. So we also ask people, again, this is quite a busy slide, but what we're looking at are the verticals and then the types of risks. We ask them, what keeps you awake at night? What are you really worried about? What are your biggest concerns? And what's quite interesting is that when we look sort of across the board, it's threats to operational safety, it's misconfiguration and unintentional shutdowns, and things like inadequate change management, which make up a good 50 to 60% of each one of these vertical sort of concerns. And what's interesting about it is they're obviously more operational concerns than cyber. And so the things like the classic sort of cybersecurity types of threats would be ransomware, malware, APTs, and data exfiltration, which again is kind of different balance between what we see in OT to IT. So that was quite interesting as well. Getting towards the end now, we asked people what type of solutions and strategies that they've actually put in place to secure their remote access so far. And I guess sometimes the response is more in general. We see defense in depth, which is quite common both in generic cybersecurity, but definitely in industrial and OT cybersecurity. Obviously, adding another layer of another perimeter, if you like, another layer of defense is always a good idea. Things like network segmentation, we can see here as a solution, right? Segmenting off the network, making sure that traffic and data can't go between segments or between zones. What's interesting is we do see some what we would assume were more IT type of solutions creeping in here with MFA and identity access. And I guess this sort of underlines the concern about how do we actually increase, how do we actually understand who's coming into the environment? And I think what's also surprising is that we have zero trust actually creeping up here. So again, my assumption is we did this a year ago, even zero trust wouldn't have been on the slide at all. So I think that also equates to the type of solutions that people are deploying. The idea is, how do we mature our approach to securing the remote access? And I think things like MFA, IAM, and zero trust are people's sort of vision about how to get this done. Lastly, and for my money, the most interesting is we went out and asked respondents to, first of all, sort of tell us what their level of concern, right? 0 is we're not concerned at all. 10 is we're very concerned. What's the level of concern with regards to risk coming through or risk associated with enabling remote access? And we can see across the board, the level of concern starting 7, 8, 9 is very, very high. And then at the same time, we went out and asked them what's their level of confidence in the solutions and strategies that they've deployed. And that significantly came out much lower. So for us, the key takeaway here is that where there are solutions around and even deployed in strategies, the people that have actually deployed them or are using them are not all that confident that they will minimize the risk safely. So I think that the takeaway here is that people are very concerned, which is great. There's a lot of awareness about having to secure the remote access, but we're still not quite there, not as mature when it comes to changing the picture and minimizing the risks associated with that. So again, as Samuel mentioned, we'll be sharing the report with all the survey and the findings very shortly too. So Samuel, back to you.
Yeah, awesome, Jonathan. I mean, there's a lot of great detail in what you've shared there, and we're going to dive into a lot of it and kind of have a little discussion about that. But as we get started on that, another question for you to drop in the chat. And again, first off, if you have questions about anything Jonathan shared, I see some that are already in the question and answer session, the Q&A. Please write them in there. We will ask them kind of live and go through them as best as we can. But next question for the chat, we want to know which side of the equation you came from. So if you're working currently in OT cybersecurity today, did you come to that role from the IT side of the house or from a traditional IT security background? Or did you come to that role coming up through the shop floor, working on the OT side of the house? Just drop your answer in the chat real quick. We'll be able to see it and respond to that. And some folks dropping answers in there. Thank you for that. Wonderful to see. One question that did come in the Q&A, Jonathan, as people are typing their answers, somebody asked about, or Nicholas asked about the breakdown in respondents regarding the framework. And they wanted to know whether, kind of that deep dive into the framework adherence being driven by like negative feedback, such as a fine for non-compliance or things like that. I know your report has a lot of that detail, but any thoughts you have about the framework adherence based off of a negative feedback loop?
Well, that's an interesting question. I know that Kevin has a lot to say about compliance and frameworks as well. What I would say is that there are many different frameworks and many different guidelines and security directives and regulations and executive orders, and they seem to be coming thick and fast, and they're not easy to follow. Now, we have obviously seen some reaction, for example, the Colonial Pipeline followed by the TSA, closely by the TSA directive, those type of things. We've seen now the FDA is regulating, ensuring cybersecurity of medical devices, right? You have to submit a plan to monitor and identify vulnerabilities and exploits in your medical devices, so you don't get the FDA stamp of approval. And things like the FAR and the DFAR for manufacturers dealing with the US government under NIST, I think it's 800-171, and that's just in the US, right? In Europe, you have the NIST 2 directive that went out not too long ago, which is an update to the original NIST 1. You had the Cybersecurity Resiliency Act that went out again just a bit before that. Again, they're all about trying to strengthen the sort of the industry's defenses against cyber threats, whether they're focused on the equipment suppliers or the actual asset owners and operators. So long story short, very few of these sort of regulations, again, apart from sort of NERC-CIP, as I understand it, have a stick as opposed, in terms of fines and negative consequences. I think that at the moment, the most negative consequence is your company being hacked, or your company being breached, or something untoward happening, whether that's ransomware and causes you to, take production offline. What's interesting that I should say is like in Europe in particular under NIST 2, it significantly broadens the scope of what the original NIST was covering. So you have chemical manufacturer, medical, food, these types of things. But it actually also mandates personal liability for management of companies and boards. So organizations there may face sort of enforcement and fines for non-compliance. So I think in that case, it could be more of a concern. But unfortunately, when you look at European as opposed to US, Europeans sort of outlay the framework, but don't exactly, they leave it up to the member states a lot of times to figure out the sort of nitty gritty. So I think the short answer is it really depends where you are. The long answer, you need to keep an eye on it, but I think at the moment it's more about reputation. It's more about how the market in general perceives that you've been hacked or you're breached
Gotcha.
or your ability to deliver service.
Awesome. Well, Kevin, I wanted to ask you this question about, you've looked at all this data, you've seen a lot of the responses and everything. What were some of the things that jumped out at you in this survey? Some of the things that were top of mind for you?
Well, I think the one thing that really jumped out to me top of mind was the balance of why people are doing the security posture, doing the defense in depth, the other things that is out there. And Jonathan's data articulated that very clearly, that from the largest organizations to the smallest organizations, they're not worried about the fear, the FUD out there. They're worried about true real world safety, misconfiguration, and other things, and getting their hands around that. And if they can get their hands around that, irrespective of the frameworks, they can provide a better defense in depth. When Jonathan just answered about the frameworks out there, I view frameworks and I view policies and regulations that come out as something bad has happened. We now need a regulation. It's the tail wagging the dog in many instances.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, you're now starting to see things like the FDA that are trying to be proactive because they can see beyond the horizon. The challenge we have as an industry is getting the manufacturers and the vendors of these equipments to also have that forethought without government compliance coming in, because a device that you put in Europe is now going to have different standards if it's migrated to the US or vice versa, or emerging areas such as Africa or other regions. So I really think that it's the balance. I think organizations are getting it. And I think us as practitioners really have to provide them solutions that work across a full range of platforms.
Yeah. So you're noticing that there's, the challenges are there, whether you're a big company, small company, whether you have, millions of assets or thousands of assets, like the challenges of providing remote access, those exist. And so, Jonathan, I know you mentioned in the results, one of the main reasons people want to provide this access is for external third parties like vendors or OEMs or other folks. Can you comment a little bit about some of the reasons why we're extending this access today?
I think it's a good question, and the answer really depends also on specifically on the industry. So there will be industries that are more sort of open to giving remote access, and there'll be industries that are sort of more adverse. So for example, I had a client that I invited to this webinar, and they're based in the Middle East region, and they typically join our webinars and really appreciate them, but they said there was no need for them to join this webinar because in their part of the world, they were not legally allowed to remote access their environment. And that was sort of in the oil and gas region industry. So there are certain industries that under no circumstances or very few circumstances will enable that. But then I would think also on the flip side, there are industries that are more sort of open to that and require it. So, and I think if you look at manufacturing, for example, and like manufacturing is a lot more what we call sort of IT friendly. And obviously that in particular, if you look at things like Industry 4.0, there's a real need to try and get the data out and get as much data as you can to sort of look at the productivity. So the manufacturing on the flip side would require a lot of this more sort of close collaboration and convergence, but definitely the need to get in and get this information out. And in other areas when we look at, if we look at, for example, in the energy sector, the move from sort of fossil fuels to renewable fuels, things like wind farms, it's not typical that you're going to send out someone to every single turbine, for example. So there are things that are very industry specific, and I think it relates also to the risk appetite of the company itself.
Kevin, I know that it was fascinating to me to see there was a huge disparity between the primary reason being they wanted to connect external third parties, OEMs, and then there was a really small number that had like telemetry data that they wanted to extract from these devices remotely. What are your thoughts on that?
So this is where when we look at the telemetry, and we're hearing this more and more, it's not just about getting people in. It's about getting data out. And this is where Industry 4.0 and other, metrics and telemetry are really becoming important to business. It's really comes down to efficiency. But that efficiency right now has sort of been muddied because vendors come in, drop in a system, it goes to the cloud, that data is now aggregated somewhere else, and customers are losing visibility and context. One of the other parts that's really important to control that choke point of that data is to give one path out so that you can inspect, manage, and control it. But also organizations are now coming up to an epiphany where companies are out there collecting all this data from different sources. This data is now being correlated, and they're extracting real value and knowledge out of this that the end customers are missing. So as telemetry data now becomes smarter, they're looking at energy efficiency across all of your homes. They're looking at the production of wind turbines, ships, how they're performing. As these aggregators have access to data, now it becomes even more important to control the flow of it, because that is going to become intellectual and business property that we have to look forward to.
Yeah, and I think it's a fascinating conversation, right? I mean, these connections are happening, and like you said, Kevin, whether it was the OEM that was on site and just left a remote connection box of some kind because they wanted to get back in later, or they wanted to stream data from it, or whatever it is that they're doing. I think it's just a fascinating thing. But Jonathan, I know you brought up a very interesting thing that I thought was really germane to the conversation, is that level of concern versus the level of confidence. I thought those two, that disparity, I thought was something fascinating to observe. Because on one hand, it's like we all, I think everyone here, at least on us on the panel here, we all agree this is a big problem. This is something that is happening today. There's not enough control, not enough security, not enough detail to be able to really do it in a safe and effective way. So that's a big problem. But the level of confidence, so that being said, if there's a big problem, we need to apply good thought and resource to it. But it seems like there's a disparity between the level of confidence and how we're solving that problem today.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and that really bore out in the numbers. And so I guess one interpretation, again, it's very tricky to sort of make qualitative interpretations of this quantitative data, but I think when we look at the breakdown of the roles, people that sort of responded to the survey, most of those job titles or job descriptions, they understand risk. And I think what we've seen over the last few years is this sort of maturity in our industry, is the people looking after these environments and trying to secure them have sort of moved from being sort of focused, not everyone's moved, but focused on the vulnerabilities to focusing on risk. Because if there's one topic that sort of cuts across all those roles, and when you look at that RACI model that I shared, that's a common language, right? The automation engineers, the folks, the engineers out in the plants, they understand risk, right? They're engineers, that's what they do. And more it's sort of seeping into the other parts, and often you'll find a chief risk officer. So I think that the gap that you see is people understanding and I guess, expressing their concern about the risk. And I think, as an industry, there are parts of, I guess it seeps over from the IT space, is this focus on vulnerabilities. But vulnerability is not a risk, right? It needs to be contextualized. Can it be exploited? And if so, what are the consequences? So it's very much balanced between, an engineer looking at this and I guess an IT person looking at it. I think you see things like methodologies, initiatives like the CIE and CCE from the US. So a lot of acronyms, and it's the US DOE and IL, but cyber-informed engineering and cyber consequence-driven engineering. So very much engineering concepts that are brought to this, so people can understand, what their most critical functions are, and focus on determining what most effective means of really mitigating those risks. And I think that kind of goes some way to explain the gap and shows the maturity that we're starting to see.
So you would say that that's almost a positive thing in some ways, because we're identifying that there's a gap, and as we're maturing, that gap, we would expect it to start closing, right? But it's an early sign of maturity, kind of, is what you're saying?
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
definitely think the fact that there's a gap there means that people are not confident in what they have deployed, means that they're not everyone, but a lot of people quite aware that they have risks that their company's risk appetite is not okay with. So it helps them identify, okay, what should they do next? And what we've seen in our sort of wider research around remote access is that it's very much a journey, like most things in cybersecurity, and where people may still have devices that are directly connected to external networks. They may be using VPNs. If they're doing remote access, they're already doing it in some way. But they may be very aware that the way they're doing it is quite risky. And so I think that, yes, we're seeing this sort of honesty coming out in this report, and I think that's what we're seeing in the industry too.
And Kevin, what's your perception on this? That disparity between the level of concern and the level of confidence that they have in what they're doing to lower that risk?
Well, I think it all gets back to knowing their baseline and knowing their environment. And I've seen a couple of the questions have been about, assets and, access around that. You can walk into any facility, do any audit, which I've done many. And the first thing you ask them is, do you know your assets? And the confidence is never there.
Right.
I don't care what the survey results show, you always find things in the environment. Those are entry points to systems, not just from a hacker breaking in. That's low on the list in many instances based on the industry. They're more worried about doing something to a system that's going to cause volatility. The 5 nines is the uptime that really impacts them because they can correlate that cost. So as you look at the threats, as you look at the confidence, it all gets back to, if you don't know your baseline, nothing else can function from that. Your top 5 SANs, critical controls. I've told people, draw out a network architecture map, put what assets talk to what assets, and then you can build there and say who logs in, what data flows back and forth, what port services. Walk into any organization and say, show me your architecture maps, and have confidence in them. And Jonathan, you can corroborate this. People you work with, it's like, well, here's a diagram dated 6 months ago. There's no confidence. And if you don't have confidence, how can you securely do something without that?
Yeah, I would just jump in and say, first of all, I agree that that's definitely the starting point. We still see a lot of people without that sort of knowledge, and that knowledge, obviously, people are it's like the deer in the headlights sort of thing. And I think, again, not trying to be judgmental, but we see quite, say, a few announcements with regards, particularly to ransomware impacting industrial sort of companies. And very often the press release or the announcement will say that, okay, this particular company has had a ransomware incident. The ransomware did not make it through to the operational environment, but in an abundance of caution, we decided to take our operational systems offline. And I think that's exactly underlines what Kevin just said. We are not confident that we know that what's actually there and how it works. So we're taking our systems offline so we can go back and do the work that maybe we should have done before and not have to take our systems offline. Again, it's an overall comment, but I think that once you have that confidence and once you have that knowledge, it's, again, like the difference between vulnerabilities and risks, right? There's a whole lot of contextualization that has to happen. A risk is only interesting if it's in a critical part of the network, if it's in a critical process. If that risk can actually be, if that vulnerability can actually exploit from the outside, and if so, how do you get there? And the knowledge that Kevin was talking about, exactly that.
What I would also say too, it's, obviously there's been a lot of talk. We got to understand the assets. We got to understand how they're laid out. We got to understand the connectivity. And you're right. There's probably not a single environment in the world that, I would say it this way. It's very difficult to get that list together. As you guys know, it's very challenging. There's a lot of work. I've heard of people, crawling around the floor, tracing a single wire, trying to find what is it connected to, because that's just what they had to do. However, what would you guys say? I mean, this secure remote access idea, right? To your point, Jonathan, can it be accessed? I mean, the vulnerability is there. The problem is there, but can it be accessed? How can it be connected? And then how could it be remotely executed? I would argue like secure remote access is maybe one of the faster ways to create some significant impact on your just the risk landscape in general of your operational environment. And I'm curious your thoughts on that. I mean, obviously we got to do that work. We got to understand what's there. We got to define it, list it, map it, all of those pieces there. But wouldn't you say like we probably should start shutting doors on the front end while we're doing that, or before we do that work, or before or as we're doing that work? What would you guys say to that? Let's start with you, Kevin.
So secure remote access is important. We're seeing now people wanting to put it further down in the Purdue model, right down into the production cells. The reason they want to do this is because they're concerned about movement laterally, jump hosts, command and control, anything like that from that infrastructure that they do not control, either through IT coming in or along that path down to those cells. And so secure remote access, when deployed in functional granular access control methods, is really a helpful solution, because now it increases business productivity, because one of the biggest challenges right now is getting people in that have the skills to maintain and manage these equipment. But it's also getting that data out. I saw one of the questions in the chat about IT to OT should not be considered basically combining them. You're right, it is an interfacing. And this is what secure remote access really is. It's an interfacing or a bridging of external or even internal arm's length resources to get down to finite areas of your environment. I do not feel that secure remote access should be just dropped in and said you can go everywhere, because that has caused significant damage to environments because they can't control the movement. If you don't know your assets, you don't know your movement, you're just injecting another point of concern.
Yeah, I think very true. And I think what we need to keep in mind is that, the old adage about people don't buy a drill because they want a drill, they want the hole, right? And secure remote access is about what do you actually do with it. It's not, hey, let's give everybody access because they're sitting at home or they're remote. So it's a tool to serve specific business requirements that obviously you need to be authorized and to do that, whether you're inside employee of the company or an external service provider.
Right.
And a lot of times it's the engineers that need that access to the assets. The idea is to be able to provide that without compromising the security of the environment unnecessarily. Again, there's always the risk. There's no such thing as adding particular connectivity and not adding risk. The idea is make sure that you understand the risks and you can manage them. And so when we look at this sort of project, that's why the diverse team is so important to be able to get also users of the system. I don't know if you recall, but the sort of, I think it was ease of use or it came out quite low. I think that the people that probably put ease of use were the ones that even third-party service providers or the engineers that wanted to use the system. We're all very concerned about securing that remote access, but sometimes we forget that it's people that actually need to use it. So it's not always, it's the IT people that sometimes will buy the platform or, sort of tapped on the shoulder, okay, we need remote access. It's the cyber or the OT cybersecurity people that are charged with securing it, but it's the engineers and the plant people, the people that actually have to work on the PLCs and devices that need that access. So there's always a balance. And I guess, this goes back to something that I know Kevin is very passionate about, the people, the process, the technology. The people are often the hardest part because they're so diverse and they're so used to doing things the way they've done them. So I think it's very important to keep all of that in mind.
And it's a great question that's come in on the Q&A. And again, if you guys are thinking of things that you want to ask, we'll put them in the Q&A section. I see a lot of things coming in the chat. Great observations, some fantastic thoughts there. But if you have specific questions you want us to get to, this one's from Christian, and they say convenience seems to be driving the discussion rather than risk mitigation. That's what you were talking about, Jonathan, a little bit of, we have users that are needing access for whatever reason. And he asked about, kind of the fundamental question of making network segmentation better for this remote two-way access, or versus, securely getting operational data out. But, so he was commenting on, so the question really comes down to it. Is it vendors that are driving these trends, or is it frameworks that are driving this? What do you think, Kevin?
I honestly think at this point, it's a combination of both, because I do not know of one framework out there that does not have a vendor on the panel influencing. And we saw that with the TSA, where the regs came out, and then with the pushback of the customers and vendors, they were changed. And so the ironic thing I feel is, if you look at the frameworks, let's take one feature of multi-factor authentication, which is coming up everywhere. You can look at a presentation and say that this is a positive thing. And then you can look at a CISA presentation from a region and say that it's a risk factor in the same presentation, because of, as Jonathan pointed out, the human factor of somebody at 2 a.m. just hitting their phone to let them in. So the technology is there. Baselining is something we need to work on. And the frameworks are driven by a combination of both vendors, the organizations, and it really comes down to the need of security, Jonathan, and how we put it all together. But I think what we need is a more codifying and unifying of the framework, so that everybody can play from one playbook.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I may have mentioned before, there are a lot of frameworks, and it's just getting more and more complicated for people that have to actually sort of either align or comply with regulations that are out or coming out. It's going to be very confusing. And I think, offhand, each one of those frameworks that we put up before has sections that relate specifically to remote access. Definitely NIST 62443. And obviously NUCSIP as well. But one thing I will add is, a couple of years ago, when the pandemic hit, we actually sort of focused on a lot of pharmaceutical companies at the time, trying to figure out particular pharmaceutical companies who was well positioned, and probably beyond pharmaceutical companies as well. There was just this everybody. The bosses just sent everyone home. It's like, go home, don't come into the office. And so there was this knee-jerk reaction that the CEO would then call the CIO, or the IT director, or again, this is like a 50,000 employee company or a 5 employee company, is exactly the same process. It's like, yeah, I just sent everybody home. How can I keep them working? And so there was a knee-jerk reaction, and we saw in many sort of environments that are, I guess we'd call it sort of classic industrial enterprise, oil and gas and electricity and power. And they were actually sequestering people inside those environments, and people that spent weeks and weeks on site. And other companies were just being sent home. And then, as I said, the next call was, how do we get people? So there's sort of a knee-jerk reaction that said, okay, there was an overriding business need to get people connected. Nobody at that point was talking about cybersecurity. In the particular case of the pharmaceutical companies that we spoke to at the time, a lot of them were quite well positioned with solutions in place, but I don't think that was necessarily the case in sort of across wider industries. So I think it comes from many different sides. Again, nobody really saw that pandemic coming and the need to do that, but some people were positioned well to take care of it. Most were probably not.
I would say too, like, especially from a frameworks perspective, like, they're usually reactive. Like, frameworks are usually kind of an after the fact codification of some best practices, or here's what we think would be really good. And as you talked about earlier, whether there's any incentives or disincentives or penalties, it's another thing. But I think the vendors and the vendor access is probably driving this a lot more than the frameworks would be, just because frameworks are reacting to the fact that vendors are accessing it. It's another question that's come in over the Q&A. It's from Anonymous, the ever-present anonymous attendee. One of the biggest challenges in the manufacturing world is the fight, and they put air quotes around fight, between manufacturers, factory owners, and their industrial vendors, their OEMs. And everyone has different preferences and solutions, and manufacturers want control and audit and all the details, whereas the vendors, the OEMs, want comfort. That's what they said. I would imagine maybe ease of use or speed to, mean time to recovery, that kind of stuff. What are your thoughts on that, Kevin? Just that kind of that dichotomy, it seems, between what the manufacturing vertical needs and what the OEMs that serve them would want.
So it's become a very big challenge, just like the battle between IT versus OT and what they implement and how they implement it. And where it really comes down to is, I work with a lot of the vendors out there. They build their components in many instances for the masses. You will find certain vendors in certain verticals, but overall, we'll build this component to fit XYZ industry. The systems are built with architecture and logic and that do very rudimentary things. You're not going to go down to, let's say, a factory talk system and start doing massive auditing on it when you have a shared credential. So now there's a lot of groups out there that are trying to bring these foundational concepts together of sharing even between vendors. And I think that's where this was born of is vendors were very proprietary with what they did. They gave you very little data. They didn't really play nice with each other. And that trickled up to the business side of the companies. The business side of the companies were being pushed down by audit and internal compliance to say, I need to know what's going on, where and how and why. And the challenge was born. These vendors have very finite components that last for decades in many instances. To have something that you view as an IT asset that we're going to upgrade next week, and the customer wants it from the OEM side, that takes a lot of rigor and regression, because in honesty, if it was a pacemaker, for example, would you want somebody to auto update your pacemaker? So there's that balance of real world versus production world versus IT world. And we have to bring them all together for the better of everybody, no doubt.
And Jonathan, any final comments on that?
Yeah, I would add that I think one of the points that you read out in the question is ease of use. So you have to remember that in some of these sites, it could be manufacturing, could be oil and gas, or it could be any sort of vertical, that they often have a huge number of external parties coming, whether they're vendors, service providers, etc. They're coming in. Now, one of the biggest challenges that we see is that there are so many backdoors into these systems. And again, with regards to our sort of guidelines in the research that we provide, the first thing you want to do is do an assessment, find all of those remote connections and close them down, and try and put everybody on a centralized platform where you can then, do authorization, do accounting, do understand what's going on, etc. All those good features that you can do once you know everyone's coming through the same sort of toll booth. Now, flip that around and look at it from the services provider's point of view, right? Companies like Rockwell, Honeywell, Yokogawa. These guys are doing services for hundreds and hundreds of companies. Now, if every company has a different platform, that kind of makes life difficult for them, because every time they go to a new customer client, they need to either learn a new platform or. So I think there's a trade-off as well between what's right for the customer and what makes sense for the vendor or for the OEM as well.
Well, Jonathan and Kevin, I know this is going to feel a little abrupt, but this conversation has just been flying by. I've really, really enjoyed hearing your thoughts on a lot of this, but we're going to be kind of getting to the end of our time here. And here's how you know it's a great conversation is we have way more questions in the Q&A and in the chat here than we've been able to get to. So for those of you that dropped your questions in there, we will get them and we will send you a response to answer some of the thoughts that you have here. Great conversation. But I know we didn't get to talk about one piece of it that I was excited to, but Jonathan, I would say the summation of this survey is that we have a big problem around remote access. It's being driven by external connectors, and there's a maturing of this industry that is really refreshing to see, where we have the level of concern is high, the level of confidence is appropriately gapped, and we're growing that. We're going to close that gap over the next couple of years, I would imagine. And we're also starting to see that role, the OT cybersecurity specialist role, the person who is fluent in the OT world, their ICS world, and also the cybersecurity practices that are needed. That's also a great sign of maturity, I would think, too. And for those of you, yes, you will get a copy of this research report once it is published. I know Jonathan and his team are crunching the last numbers and formatting the last sentences, and that research report will be out shortly. We will send an email copy of it to you. And this recording will also live on for posterity, so you can come back and listen to the conversation and continue on from there. Jonathan, Kevin, want to thank you both for your time chatting about this topic today and for sharing your considerable knowledge with all of us. And for those of you that have joined us today, thank you as well for spending a few minutes of your time with us today. So from Cyolo, from Industrial Cyber and TP Research, thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Samuel. Pleasure,
Thank you.
Kevin.
Same to you, Jonathan.
Bye-bye.